Thank you, Mary. Yeah, it's my pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Kevin Briggs. He's been involved with EMP assessments and mitigation for decades. As an Air Force officer, he assessed electromagnetic and nuclear threats as a member of the DoD Red Planning Board and gained approval for installing EMP-protected communications into the White House and other leadership sites. Later, as a government civilian, he served as the director of the National Command Authority and Nuclear C3 Plans and Engineering Division at DISA. He then served as the director of the Readiness Division at FEMA, where he obtained funding from Congress to EMP protect the emergency alert system's primary entry point radio stations across the country. He left FEMA and now serves as the Chief of Continuity Assessment and Resilience within the Department of Homeland Security's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. And he's also the principal editor for the DHS EMP Protection and Restoration Guidelines for Equipment and Facilities. With that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kevin Briggs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to Mary and Bill. Appreciate the fact that InfraGard and the FBI are asking for a briefing today on the communication sector vulnerabilities to nuclear EMP events. We're swinging it back from solar back into the nuclear realm. And what I'll be talking about today are comm sector vulnerabilities. This is everything from undersea cables to satellites to all the terrestrial. And I'm appreciative that there was a request that we focus in on how do you mitigate these types of attacks. So we'll look at things that can empower you to protect your systems as well. The DHS believes that the EMP threat has been growing over several decades. It's rather simple to see. Like when I started these types of assessments back in the 1980s, we focused primarily on Russia. And as you know, the circle has widened and widened, and as we have described on the slide, back on the 3rd of September of this year, North Korea tested what they claimed was a hydrogen bomb. Whether or not it meets all that criteria, I don't know, but I do know this: it was a much higher yield than in previous tests, and higher yields translate into a much more effective E3 component of EMP. Of particular concern was that they said we have achieved a strategic objective. And so on the same day that they burst this weapon, they put out an official statement to the effect of, this is in alignment with our strategic goals. And for many of us who've been tracking them over the years, it's a disturbing event. So, as you look at history and you think of important dates in history, 3 September was a rather important one in the EMP world. I want to point out, too, that they have lots of means of delivering these type of devices. It's not just the missile we saw launched on Tuesday that could take it, over the mid-CONUS or wherever pretty much they want. That's the Hwasong 15. Back in July, they launched 2 successful Hwasong 14s, and they have others that they can put on boats. And this is true for many nation states. It doesn't take an intercontinental ballistic missile, as others have pointed out, to put a missile over the United States. And to widen the circle a little more, back in, around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, one of my associates went over and tried to hire expertise in the EMP arena. They were trying to hire either out of work or underemployed Russian scientists. And he was a little dismayed because when he went over there with one of the national labs groups, he tried to engage in folks that were available. And what he was told is, you're too late. There's 2 countries that have been hiring our available EMP expertise. You can guess which 2 those are. One was North Korea. The other one was Iran. So we need to keep our eyes on that as well. Now, as we look at the threat that is increasing, the power grid, and you just know from an electronic standpoint, when you go from the 60s and tubes that are pretty resilient to these types of effects to the current day microelectronics, we have very much of an increase in our vulnerability to EMP.
I'll be touching on some of those at the unclassified level using generic warheads and just some coupling calculations that show what happens to your Ethernet, what happens to your plain old telephone lines and the like. We take seriously what the EMP Commission has recommended to the department, and we are, based on presidential policy and just the mandates that we have in DHS, we take very seriously the role of promoting a national unity of effort to help the resilience of all of our critical infrastructures, not just the communications infrastructure. Now, I'd like to thank Dr. Baker and Dr. Radasky and others who had a real role in writing this. They did this for the military, and we asked them to do it for DHS, and they've come out with several levels of guidelines that are available. Now, the one I'm showing here is FOUO, in that it has some scenarios in the back, but for the comm sector in particular, they have been asking for these for years, and these are available. This is a page out of the front of this book showing that there are 4 levels of EMP protection that we're going to talk about very briefly today. The first level is low cost, no cost. What can you do with the minimal effort? But like if you see the risk exponentiating for whatever reason in the next few weeks, months, and you don't have time to buy a whole lot of protective equipment, what can you do? Thankfully, there is a lot that you can do, and some of it's actually rather simple, but you just have to think through it in advance. The first thing is turn off your equipment. If you've only got a few minutes, turn it off. If you've got a few more minutes, you want to unplug all the lines going into that equipment. Those are power lines, data lines, your antenna cables, and the like. And you want to unplug them from the very closest point of entry into your computers and other equipment. If you can't remove the power cord, these are like big antennas for EMP. All these lines are where the main vulnerabilities are. So you want to take these long cords. If you can't disconnect it from the equipment, you want to disconnect it wherever you can, and from the router closet or whatever, and then roll it up and put it right next to the equipment. That's the next best thing you can do. If you've got small equipment, there are things, it may sound like a joke, but things like aluminum foil, these little Faraday bags that are inexpensive, you can put things into there, and we have guidance on how you can do that effectively. That's not one of the bigger recommendations we're pushing, but it can work. One thing that is actually a little more important that I don't have up on the slide is like your batteries in your handheld devices. If you've got LMR gear or other handhelds that you really want to protect, they're inherently resilient other than to a very big EMP event. But if you want to be especially assured that that's going to work, pop the batteries. If you have a spark and then you have batteries, it works together with the EMP and can fry your devices. So popping batteries for a non-essential piece of gear can work. I want to put a plug in for some of our DHS priority service programs. Who knows what this is? Yeah, a GETS card. If you are associated with the National Security Emergency Preparedness world in any form or fashion, and you don't have to be US even, you can be in Canada or Mexico. These GETS cards are available. You can go online to the Office of Emergency Communications. I've got a couple of the links down here, but we have this for the landline service, giving you priority service. And in prior disasters, what we found is people without these type of priority access cards can really be slammed. There's times where the switching cannot handle all the traffic coming in. And so when you have a major event, what this does is it enable you to use whatever surviving equipment exists still. And that's true on the WPS side for your wireless, and it's a good thing to look into if you have that role or mission. I'd like to also plug one of the programs under my group is the Shares program. If the internet goes out, if the basically your phone service on the commercial side goes down, the Shares program is a great backup set of capabilities. We've got like 1,800 stations across the country for HF, There is some SATCOM and the like. Again, due to time, I'll just refer you to the links. The second level of protection, this is where you start incurring more costs, but you're actually putting surge protective devices into the lines. And that can be even the low-cost things you get, and I hate to say it almost because I believe in testing, and a lot of these haven't been tested, but a lot of them claim that they can do 1 nanosecond and the like these surge strips. They've got MOV technology. What I hope is someday we have a more robust program that's testing all these claimed capabilities that are low cost and where we can actually verify, yes, these indeed work. But for right now, you can go out and you can buy other types of surge protective gear for your equipment. We recommend that you use a little more expensive online double conversion, UPSs. Those that are less expensive don't trip quickly enough, and so you do have to pay a little more. Even just the very low cost things like ferrites on your data cables, clipping those near the back end of your equipment, those are 1 to 2 dB of protection per bead for your data side. On level 3, and what I would recommend, and as far as you're able, you want to get to level 3 if you have any life or limb oriented mission like fire, police, hospitals, and the like. Here's where you're actually going to putting in shielded rooms, racks, and equipment, even entire facilities. It's more expensive. It's different than the DoD levels. We do recommend the International Electrotechnical Commission's guidance, and I'll have another slide on that here in a moment. The differences that we are putting forth is that you don't necessarily need 80 dB of protection for a lot of these missions. That adds additional cost. It's important for nuclear command and control. It's important for the president. Maybe a little less important for your local fire and police. And I'll put another plug in, and you'll see here in a moment why. You want to look into HF radio, and you want to look into SATCOM, especially SATCOM that goes up to geosynchronous. You'll see why here in a few minutes. Here's the SC77 series publications with the IEC. Goes from everything from testing to how you install this equipment into your facilities. Now, it's a bit of an eye chart, but in this case, that's some of the graphics out of our guide here. You have a 1 megaton going off. This is the canonical one over the central United States. Of note, it goes way up into Canada and down into Mexico, and you see a lot of red. In this case, it's your AC/DC wall warts. We actually did some testing on those. Those fail rather dramatically. And so if you have no protection on your AC/DC converters going into your equipment, there's a good chance that those are going to blow. But with 30 dB of protection, things get a lot better. Now, I'm not saying 30 dB is where you end. This is the generic, it's not the enhanced warhead type of event, but you're a lot better with that. Same story for like a 100-foot Ethernet cable, a little less damage across the country, but you can see that with the 30 dB of protection, which is the minimum for level 3, a lot of equipment would survive. And then the plain old telephone lines coming in, same thing. Now, level 4 I won't really go into. That's the mill standard 188, 125. That's what you need for your most critical command and control, like the nuclear command and control mission space. We've gone through some of these in earlier presentations, so I'm going to go quickly through the background of EMP. But I want to start with this slide. This is an adaptation I did years ago of something that General Lobrev briefed to the international community. It was the results of their testing of a 300 kiloton at 290 kilometer altitude. That is not an optimal altitude for like E1 EMP by any means. So you have a suboptimal burst height and the like. But even with the tube technologies of the day, you'll see that the damage went out for hundreds of kilometers around this burst. Now, the Russians didn't do it over their area. This is over Kazakhstan. But they blew out almost all of the regional overhead communications lines and power. And there are anecdotal reports that even a power station went up in flames. Oh, I do want to go back and say, bottom right-hand side, note that after the Russians did this test, they put their best folks onto how do you protect critical infrastructure, communications and the like. It's an important lesson for us to learn. E1, E2, E3, many briefers have gone through that. I'll just say E1 doesn't require, and this is one of those myths, it doesn't require a large yield weapon. You can have a very low yield weapon and just good gamma output, and we can't really go into details. I'll just say, even with some of the prior bursts that we've seen tested in North Korea, they're relatively low yield. They can create a real problem. The E3 is the other major concern, and in that case, you've got effects that are much higher than you would see in a geomagnetic storm, but thankfully for a briefer period. However, 300 seconds of something in the tens of nanoteslas per minute can create a real problem. Just so you have a visual on what E1, E2, E3 is, this is one I adapted from a DITRA presentation of many years ago. But basically, on the left-hand side, you've got the prompt less than a millionth of a second E1 pulse, and it can couple into things like aircraft, create all sorts of problems with anything with a cord going into it. Whereas on the far right-hand side, the E3, and for a communications talk like we're having today, we're mainly concerned about the undersea cable infrastructure. That's a common graphic. Again, if we had one over the United States, at 400 kilometers, it goes way up into Canada and into Mexico as well. So it becomes an international problem immediately. And I want to say you don't have to have the ICBM. From the coast, and like in the Gulf, and I can't go into the details, but we have modeled several scenarios where you're launching from a ship, and it only takes 7 to 8 minutes to get over the central part of the CONUS. And that's with where there's lots of intermediate range missiles out there that can do that from various countries. Now, I'm going to focus in a little bit on some statements that North Korea has said. I'm not endorsing New York Times, and it's not the DHS position here. But what I am saying is that it's in the media, and we see that they are saying we're going to launch, in this case, Hwasong-12 missiles all around Guam. It's one of their counter-provocative statements. Then a little later in September, they said, and this was in New York, at their foreign minister level, he was saying that they would be considering testing a nuclear device over the Pacific. Well, what does that mean? We obviously know that they're thinking about EMP. Whether they meant that in this case, we don't know. If they do test, and I'm going to put the nexus of Pacific and the Guam threat together. From a comm perspective, Guam relies primarily on the undersea cables going into it. If those are hardened, it's great. If those are not hardened, then there could be a problem because the E1 EMP couples into the electronics at the cable landing stations, and the E3 EMP couples through depths of water and can burn out your powering elements all throughout the cables in the area. Again, this is no assessment of what would actually happen. I'm just saying there is a risk factor here we need to consider. That could be Hawaii, that could be East Coast, et cetera. Moving into space, you can see, and I'm happy to report that most of the low Earth orbiting satellites are communication satellites. But the problem here is when you have an exoatmospheric burst, you have both prompt and delayed effects that can take those down. There's an excellent DITRA report that I can refer you to at the bottom left-hand side. Came out back in 2010. Due to time, again, I'm going to just mention that the EMP Commission report has some great information on what happens to satellites with the prompt effects. And this DITRA report then goes through system-generated EMP, basically X-ray fluence hitting those satellites and doing an immediate fry on some of the electronics. The bigger problem, perhaps, is the delayed effect of the pumped Van Allen belts, the near and far, particularly with your low Earth orbiting satellites. whether it be the International Space Station or things like your various Iridium and other communication satellites. It's like putting them into an aging chamber, and all of a sudden, they went from 20 years old to 120. You got a problem. Now, as far as generic warheads over the Guam area, I've got this one in here just to show you. If you got a 20 KT, it's at 16 kilovolts per meter. And what does that mean? Well, just look at the relative difference. If it's 100 KT, which is closer to what they recently tested, it goes up to 25 kilovolts per meter. I won't go into details as to what could be the kilovolts per meter at the classified, but it might be a lot higher. So if you zoom in on this, then you can see that if you burst over the area, you can put roughly 25 kilovolts per meter into the area. But that's actually with the 100 KT. I'm going to go back to the 20 KT for a bit with the generic warheads. The bottom line is, and this is for a 100-foot Ethernet cable. There's a lot of assumptions, but you can catch me at the break if you want to know what those were. But for a 100-foot length of Ethernet cable running inside of a building, what would we potentially expect? And even with a non-enhanced warhead at 20 KT, a lot of problems, a lot of red there. That's the damage criteria. A wireline telephone, it's a very common theme here, so I'm going to go quickly through it. And there's a lot of assumptions again, but we're trying to make it reasonable. We're not trying to make this something where, we want to see red. Same thing with the AC-DC power adapters. Land mobile radio, the story gets better. In this case especially, if you've got a non-trunking land mobile radio, trunking means you're using the wireline component to interconnect. Wireline is bad in these scenarios, but if you're going from radio to radio, you may have some interruptions, but you can reset the radio and continue operations. The HF backup communications, I'll just say the Russians have a very good program, and traditionally back into the Soviet era, of protecting their HF radios. That's because that's in-band for EMP. And if you don't EMP your backups, they're going to fry the first few moments. So you need to EMP harden the antennas and other things onto your HF gear. That's true for both your dipole and your horizontal dipole and vertical monopole. Radio stations, they're big collectors of EMP, so both for the FM and AM. You may have some service if you've got an EMP hardened radio station like we've done at some of the PEP sites, but don't expect it to necessarily work if you haven't done hardening at those stations. The E3B, don't have time to really go into it other than it's a low frequency. And look at the peak here. This is one, it's 100 KT, and it's got a peak of 13,000 or over 13,000 nanoteslas per minute. When you look at the historical storms like the '89 storm or the 1921 storm, damage started occurring to parts of the networks from anywhere from 400 to 2,400 nanoteslas per minute. So we've got something that's worse, and a lot of damage can occur in a few minutes. It doesn't have to be something that's days. And so if you've got a 5-minute event, that can create real problems. Hardening, it can be inexpensive if you do it up front. Retrofitting is less, or is much more expensive. And so what we're looking at here, even if you're going to the mill standard, the most expensive type of hardening, if you do it up front, it's roughly 5% of system cost in many cases. Here's kind of a summary of what I've said. I won't go through all of these. It's just to say there's a lot of red here. You do want to look toward things like geosynchronous satellites that are much more resilient. For large yield above exoatmospheric, those can still be taken out. But for the lower yield devices, a lot of those geosynchronous may survive. HF, if you've got it EMP protected on the terminal side, the ionosphere will survive. It'll recover. It may be a while though. And you need batteries for your LMR. My conclusions are that the risk of not protecting critical infrastructure is profound. I throw up a new term here, the source region EMP. That's the second bullet here. It's what happens when you have a ground burst. I won't really discuss that much other than to say you get similar effects. It's a different waveform. It can go out to like 100 miles from the burst. But that's a localized event relative to a high altitude EMP where you're getting coverage over the entire continental United States. You can put EMP protection into systems, so when like new systems like FirstNet and others are going out there, perhaps less than 5% of the cost per site. We need guidance for more than just high altitude. We've been kind of focused on HEMP for a long time. We need the SGEMP and SREMP protection guidelines for the civil infrastructure as well. If you're near a big city, you're in the target zone. And I guess the last takeaway here is that we need EMP protection baked into all of our critical infrastructures. You can't do the mission just with power or comm, or you have to have an integrated solution. So with that, I'll take any questions if we have time.
Yeah, we'll take one or two.
Okay, yeah, because I know Dr. Graham is up next. I'm going to actually just click through some slides in the backup so you can see the presentation. It goes through some other things. But yes, go ahead. Any questions? Oh, okay. Well, I mean, no questions? It's lunchtime. I know you guys are going like, no. Okay. But here are just some slides out of the handbook here showing what happens. And this is a continental burst. Similar, but different than the other ones. Here's a study, part of a study we did for Alaska. We've done similar ones for Hawaii and other locations. You know, it's just kind of bad. Now, on the source region EMP, for 10 KT, the range of effect is only, you know, half kilometer to a kilometer of overpressure damage. When you get to the source region, like in this case with a Cat5 Ethernet, you're out 13-mile ring for damage zone. And if you're talking about those AC/DC wall warts, the damage zone went out past Baltimore, 73 miles. So gives you an idea. FM radio stations, the red is damaged, the other is upset. And cellular handsets are pretty good. You know, you don't, if you've got them turned off, they're very resilient. Okay, so that's it. I've got a few more slides on, you know, different types of missiles, but it's all, you know, you read the news, and it's not necessarily happy news. Okay, thank you.